Alright guys, so we're going to move on into our second lesson for ecology, and this is actually going to be our second and last. We're going to combine a lot of information in these first two PowerPoints. It is an easier unit in comparison to some of the other things that we've learned. Remember, you are going to have a test over the unit, but we're not going to have quizzes because we're going to spend the majority of next week working on a project, and I'll give you more details on that very shortly. In fact, I plan on probably coming on Monday to your classes and going over the project with you, or if this is in the future, whatever day lines up with this. So our next lesson is moving up in the organization. So remember that organisms make up populations, populations make up communities, and then next in the organization is ecosystems. And so we're just kind of carrying on that pattern. And so let me get this going here. What an ecosystem is it's a community, but we include the non-living materials. We include things like sunlight and air. And so the ecosystem is essentially just the combination of both the living and the non-living factors. And so an ecosystem could be something as small as a tiny puddle or a drop of water, and it can go all the way up to a huge forest like a rainforest. So there's a wide range of what an ecosystem could include. But what we do see are these systems where energy is utilized and nutrients are cycled. And so what we're going to be looking at over the course of this lesson are just the different components of the ecosystems and how they work together. And so we've seen these words before. I didn't define them in the first lesson, but they were there a couple of places. And so we're going to be looking at biotic factors, which hopefully you know that bio means life. And so these are going to be all of your living things. Now, even a dead tree would be considered a biotic factor. If it was living or is continuing to be alive, we consider that a biotic factor. We also saw this word when we talked about density-dependent factors, biotic factors like predation and disease. So those would also be kind of living interactions. And then we have abiotic factors, which put an A or an an in front of something, it means not living. And so these are going to be all of the non-living factors, which are going to be essential to maintaining an ecosystem and maintaining life. We can't live without water, we can't live without oxygen, we can't live without the sun. And so all of these things are going to be very important components as well. So we're just kind of looking at the big picture here. Now, when we're talking about especially abiotic factors, one of the things that organisms must have are nutrients. We need things like nitrogen and oxygen and water and carbon. And so one major component of ecosystems are these biogeochemical cycles. And so if we break this word down, bio refers to life processes or living organisms, geo refers to earth processes, and then of course chemical refers to chemical. So these are going to be ways in which elements and compounds and matter are kind of recycled within an ecosystem. Now these cycles are going to be a little bit different than energy. We're going to take a look at energy flow next, but energy is a one-way flow, and then your nutrients can be recycled and transferred and transformed into many different ways. And so the first one is something you learned since elementary school, the water cycle. Not a whole lot new going on here, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but obviously water is essential to life, and it moves between large bodies of water, the atmosphere, living organisms, and the earth. And so major processes include evaporation and transpiration. If you're not familiar with this one, please get familiar. Transpiration is water loss from plants. Sometimes this will say evapotranspiration because it's kind of the same process. It's just one is coming from bodies of water, one is coming from plants. And then that water that's evaporated or turned to gas can condense, it can precipitate, it can run off over the land. Percolation is when it goes down into the soil, and then it can be stored as groundwater. Now, one of the things we're going to look at with each cycle is how do humans mess it up? And what we're going to find is that humans are pretty detrimental when it comes to ecosystems. We tend to do things that negatively impact the environment around us. And so one way that we can affect the water system is through overuse. Now, obviously water is very abundant, but fresh water is not usable fresh water. And so what will happen is a lot of times we can overuse that fresh water that's available. We could pump out too much groundwater, and what can happen is we can drain aquifers. It can lead to land sinking in, called land subsidence. There's all kinds of things that can happen. Another thing we can do is we can cut down too many trees. Because transpiration is such a big part of the water cycle, if we affect the vegetation in an area, that will in turn affect the water cycle. And then another major problem that we have is polluting. We can pollute the water directly. We can also pollute the air. That can lead to acid precipitation. Another issue with putting chemicals into water bodies, and even if we don't do this intentionally, sometimes we put fertilizers and pesticides on our crops and they run off into water. But what happens is many of these chemicals cannot be broken down like in normal digestion. And so as they pass through the food chain, they actually increase in their concentration. And by the time you get to the upper levels of the food chain, we start to see pretty heavy concentrations of these chemicals, and it can lead to the death and really harm some of these higher level food chain organisms. All right, next is the carbon cycle. Now, carbon is essential because remember that as organisms, we are made up of organic molecules, things like carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, and carbon is the backbone of all of those. But we can also find carbon in other forms like carbon dioxide in the air. You can find carbon dioxide in the water. You can also find that carbon dioxide turned into bicarbonate, or carbonates that you'll find in rocks and shells like calcium carbonate. And so carbon can be found in many different forms on Earth. And so what the carbon cycle does is it just shows how it's cycled from all of these different like areas: water, land, air, organisms, deep in the earth. And so we have a lot of different processes that are involved. Now in the next slide we're going to look at what these processes essentially do. But some of these processes are going to release carbon, and some of these processes are going to store carbon. And that's really what you need to know more than anything. And so things that can store carbon is organisms. And the way organisms store carbon is by housing all of these macromolecules. Now, the way we can take that carbon from the air and store it, a major process that's needed is photosynthesis. This is a big, very important process in the carbon cycle because this is a way that living things can essentially trap carbon. Your autotrophs, your plants, they take up carbon dioxide, they turn it into those organic compounds, which then become stored in the plant. And then those are the organic compounds that can pass from one organism to another in food chains. Now, it can also be stored in rocks, like with deposition. It can be stored in shells, like when organisms make their little shells and skeletons. Over time, we can have the formation of fossil fuels. That's going to store a lot of carbon. And then the oceans are a huge carbon sink that can store carbon. Now, on the other hand, carbon can be released through releasing those stored carbons in the earth, like volcanic activity and erosion. We have some life processes like respiration and decomposition. And then another important one is combustion, or burning fossil fuels. And so once again, we're going to take a look at how do humans impact the carbon cycle. Well, a lot of these processes are natural. Photosynthesis, decomposition, deposition, erosion. Many of these things naturally occur, but what humans can do is they can increase these processes beyond the norm. And so that's what we're doing with carbon dioxide, is we're releasing carbon dioxide way faster than it can be removed from the atmosphere. And we're doing this primarily by two things. Number one, once again, we're cutting down way too many trees. Anytime we remove vegetation, that reduces photosynthesis, and therefore that carbon is not being pulled from the atmosphere. Also, by burning fossil fuels, that's releasing carbon in large amounts into the atmosphere. And the biggest issue with that is that it amplifies the greenhouse effect. Now, the greenhouse effect by itself is not bad. It's a good thing. The greenhouse effect is where gases in our atmosphere trap heat. It helps to make our Earth warm and livable. But what we're doing is by releasing too much carbon dioxide, we are making the blanket thicker. And so what's happening is we're causing that greenhouse effect to be magnified or enhanced, and that's leading to global warming and climate change. And we're not going to go into all of the effects of that, but just know that there's a lot of negative effects on ecosystems and organisms as a result of climate change. All right, the third cycle we're going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. Once again, nitrogen is essential to living things because you're going to find it in your proteins. Nitrogen is in every amino acid. You also find it in your DNA, your nitrogen bases. And so nitrogen is essential. It's essential for plant growth and it's essential for many life processes. Now the thing with nitrogen is it's not rare. Okay, nitrogen in the form of gas or N2 is very abundant. The majority of the air around you is made up of nitrogen gas, but the problem is we can't breathe it in and use it in that form. It is not usable in the gas form. So in order to make it usable, a very important part of the nitrogen cycle is a process called nitrogen fixation. And this is where the gas is turned into compounds that are then usable by living things. And so nitrogen fixation is not something that we can do. It's not something that other animals can do. It's not even something that plants can do. And this is the issue with the nitrogen cycle, is there is a certain group of bacteria called nitrogen fixing bacteria that are able to turn the gas into usable compounds. And then it can also be accomplished in the atmosphere by things like lightning and cosmic radiation, or it could also be accomplished through like fires. So the thing with nitrogen is we heavily rely on this fixation process. Now, once it's fixed, it's going to be in the soils. The plants take it in from the soils, and then from the plants, it can be passed through the food chains. So first it has to be fixed, then the plants assimilate it into their, body of sorts, and then from there it can pass from organism to organism as we go through the food chains. It can also be returned to the soil through decomposition. So through waste, death, and decay, we can return those nitrogen compounds to the soil. That's essentially what we're doing with like compost piles, is getting these nitrogen compounds and phosphates and things like that. And then there's another process that does the opposite of fixation. So it can also be turned back into a gas by the process of denitrification. And as with all the other cycles, how do we as humans mess it up? Well, this is all about fertilizers. So one of the things that we do is, because nitrogen is essential and sometimes it's limited in our soils, we create these man-made fertilizers. We're not talking about natural compost here. We're talking about these factory-made, commercially made fertilizers. And so they're filled with these nitrates and nitrites and phosphates. And so what happens is when we use them, it does help our plants grow, but when they run off into bodies of water, what happens is, just like it makes plants grow, it makes algae grow. And so what will happen is, when it gets into a pond or a lake or even an ocean, it causes a process called eutrophication. And what that does is, this overgrowth of algae can block sunlight. It causes death and decay, which requires oxygen. And what will happen is, over time, the oxygen in that water body will be depleted, which is going to affect everything else that lives there. Now, another thing that fertilizers can do is they can release nitrous oxide. And when we burn fossil fuels, we can also release nitrous oxide. And this is one of the compounds that can join with water to form acid rain. So another detrimental process. Now, regardless of what it is, whether it be nitrogen or carbon or phosphate or any other nutrient that we need, nutrient limitation is an issue that ecosystems face, because even if one is limited, it's going to affect the overall productivity. So these nutrients are incredibly important, because pretty much the basis of every ecosystem is going to be your producers. And so what primary productivity is it's how well are the producers producing. And this is why we use things like fertilizers to put those nutrients in the soils that may be lacking. Now, productivity is the rate at which organic matter or food is made by the producers. So once again, how much are the producers producing? And this can be affected by many factors, things like the nutrients in the soil, the light, the temperature, changes in climate, changes in the atmosphere. But the deal with productivity, it essentially determines the success of an ecosystem. Because if the producers are producing well, everything else is probably doing all right. If the producers are not making food, everything else is going to suffer. Now, you don't have to know this, but something I want to at least kind of mention is, remember that when the plants produce food, some of that food is for themselves. And so the primary productivity that is made originally is the gross, just like with your paycheck. And so once the plant uses some, because the plant has to do cellular respiration, whatever's left over is what we call the net primary productivity, and that's what's available to other organisms in the ecosystem. So that's really going to be your measure of success, is how much of the producers are producing and how much is available to the consumers and everything else. All right, now we're going to take a shift from nutrients into energy. And so energy is also an essential component. We have to have energy to perform all of our life functions. Now it is a little bit different because energy is not recycled. Now it is transferred and transformed, but it's a one-way flow. It can't like go back into the soil or be, returned in a certain way. It's going to go one-way flow from the original source through our food chains and food webs. And what that does is that creates our trophic structure, which is our feeding relationships. How do we get the energy that we need? Well, we get energy through food. So how does an organism get its food? How does an organism get its organic compounds? And that creates these trophic levels. And so the most important trophic level are going to be your producers or your autotrophs. This is really the better word to know for a college level class. But your autotrophs are those organisms that can make their own food. This means self-feeder. Now, most of them do it by the process of photosynthesis, things like plants and algae and some of your bacteria. But there is another autotrophic process called chemosynthesis. Not every ecosystem has light. You could be at a hydrothermal vent at the bottom of the ocean, or you could be in a cave where there's not a lot of sunlight. And so there are some organisms, some bacteria, that are able to take kind of chemicals from the earth and convert them into those carbohydrates. But primarily when we're talking about autotrophs, we're talking about photosynthesizers. So these are going to be our original food producers, and everything else on the ecosystem is going to be dependent upon them. Up next are going to be your heterotrophs, which are going to have to get their energy from somewhere else. They're going to have to eat or get it from another source. They cannot make it for themselves. Now, this is going to include all of your consumers, which physically consume or eat. Now, we kind of classify them based on what they're eating. So a primary consumer eats a producer, secondary consumer eats a primary, tertiary eats a secondary, quaternary eats a tertiary, and rarely do you see it going much higher than tertiary or quaternary. We'll talk about why here in a minute. So if an organism has to eat, they're going to be considered a consumer. Now, if you don't remember what these words mean, herbivores are plant eaters, carnivores are meat eaters, and omnivores eat both. Okay. Now, a couple of other terms, detritivores. Now, a detritivore is something like an earthworm. They sometimes are grouped with decomposers because what they'll do is they'll kind of feed on this matter that's decaying. It's kind of already broken down some, and they'll help break it down a little bit more. So like your earthworms and some of your insects. And then scavengers like a vulture, they're also considered consumers. Even though they're not eating live animals, they're still consuming. And then the last trophic level we're going to talk about are your decomposers, which are very, very important. They don't physically eat, but what they do is they release enzymes, they break down dead stuff, and then they absorb those nutrients. So they are absorbers usually. Sometimes they might be the detritivores, like I mentioned. And so they're also heterotrophs, okay? They cannot make food for themselves. They rely on another source. And this is typically going to be your mushrooms and your fungi, and then some of your bacteria are decomposers, and then sometimes we'll put these guys in the decomposer group as well. And these are very important in those nutrient cycles, recycling nitrogen, recycling carbon, because they're returning those nutrients to the soil. Now, as we mentioned, energy flows in one direction. It's not recycled, so it starts with the original source, which is typically going to be the sun. If we're talking about a dark ecosystem, it may be those chemicals for chemotrophs. And so what's going to happen is the sun is going to provide the initial energy or the chemicals. The autotrophs are going to make that food, and then it will be passed to the various heterotrophs. And we represent this flow with a simple food chain or a more complex food web. Now, I didn't go into the details about this. I'm going to assume that you remember a lot of this, but remember what the arrow says. The arrow points to where the energy is going. So if you ever get confused by that, you could always say is eaten by. The grasshopper is eaten by the frog. The frog is eaten by the snake. So just remember, arrows need to point in a certain direction. When it comes to your project, if you get your arrows backwards, that's kind of a big deal. All right, so I also want to explain the difference between a food chain and a food web. A food chain is very simple. It's just a 1, 2, 3, 4, whereas a food web is much more complex. It shows a variety of organisms being eaten or providing food for other things. It's not just a simple 1, 2, 3, 4. So really a food web is a better representation of an ecosystem. Now, as we move through these trophic levels, okay, there's going to be a loss of energy. The energy is transferred from the original source to the autotrophs to the various heterotrophs. Now, when the producers make the food, like we mentioned earlier with primary productivity, a lot of what they make they're going to use for themselves because they have to make energy for their cells too. Now, they're going to store some, and so that energy that is not used will pass to the primary consumer, which is going to use some, and then it's going to store some, which could then be passed on to the secondary consumer, and so on and so on and so on. So in addition to this loss of energy because it's being used, we also have a loss of energy in the form of heat. This is just going to happen in metabolism. Anytime you have these chemical reactions, energy is going to be lost in the form of heat. And so really only a very small amount, 10% of the energy, is going to be transferred from one level to the next. So from the producers to the primary consumer, only 10% of the energy available to those producers is going to be passed to the primary consumers. And then only 10% of that is going to be passed to the secondary consumers, and so on and so on and so on. And so we represent these changes with energy pyramids. And this is why we don't really see food chains going much higher than tertiary or quaternary consumers, because by the time you get to the top, there's really not a lot of energy available in the food that they're eating. That also means they typically have to eat a lot more. Okay, when you have a top level carnivore, they're going to have to consume a larger amount of food because there's less energy in the food that they're eating. And so what we look at with these energy pyramids are how these changes in energy occur. Now, I know this picture is a little bit blurry, but I couldn't find a better one. But what I wanted you to see is these energy pyramids, it's not always just energy. So here we see that 10%. Notice you take away a 0 each step you go up. But it could also represent biomass, and that there's less organisms available at the top. And it can also just support just your numbers. So notice that the number of those organisms is going down as we move up the pyramid. And so if you ever have to do calculations, just remember it's a 10%. So every time you move up, you take away a 0 as you see here, okay? All right, a couple more things to cover and then we're done with ecology. So if we look at our organization, sometimes this is included and sometimes it's not, but after ecosystem, sometimes you'll see the word biome. And a biome is a major type of terrestrial ecosystem typically. And so it's kind of ecosystems that are similar across the globe. And what makes them similar is their climate. So biomes are primarily classified by their climate conditions, which is going to be your temperature and your precipitation. But we also look at it in terms of plants and animals and other organisms that can live there. But that always goes back to climate. It's going to include things like seasons, amount of sunlight, the soil type, the moisture levels, and these are the types of things that are going to determine what types of plants and animals can live there. And so the biomes are just these groups of ecosystems that have unique climates and unique biodiversity. And this is what your project is going to focus on. Once again, I'm going to get this ready for you, and we'll talk about it on Monday, whether I'm there or not. But your project is going to be looking at all of these different ecological aspects of a particular biome. Now, in addition to your terrestrial biomes, you also have many different types of aquatic ecosystems. We're not going to really include those in our studies so much. We're going to focus on the biomes, but your aquatic ecosystems are very diverse as well. Now, they're going to be kind of classified more based on, are they salty or are they fresh? How much light do they get? How much nutrients do they have? We can break them down into freshwater and saltwater. Your freshwater are going to be things like your ponds and your lakes, and we can look at those based on size and depth and the nutrient availability. The saltwater ecosystems could be coastal, like your salt marshes or your estuaries, where you have a mix of salt and freshwater. And then you're going to have your basic oceans, and your oceans are classified into different zones, like open ocean, bottom of the ocean, how much light do they get, what are the depths, and what kind of organisms live there. So there's a huge amount of diversity on our Earth when it comes to ecosystems and biomes. And so that's what biodiversity is all about, the variety of life on Earth. Now we could look at biodiversity in three main ways. We could look at it in terms of ecosystem diversity. We could look at it in terms of species diversity, which normally when people think of biodiversity, that's what you think about. How many species are there? How many different kinds? How many of each? Okay, like the rainforest has a very high biodiversity, whereas the tundra, the biodiversity is going to be much lower. Now we could also look at it in terms of genetics, like what are the genes and alleles that are present and what are the frequencies of those alleles. Now biodiversity is wonderful. Diversity is always going to be wonderful. And we can kind of just look at biodiversity generally based on the size and the location of a particular ecosystem. So typically a bigger ecosystem is going to have more biodiversity. And in terms of location, usually closer to the equator where there's more direct sunlight, more production, you see greater diversity. And then as you move away from the equator toward the poles, you typically see a decline in biodiversity. Now, why do we need biodiversity? Well, it's a huge commodity for us. I mean, you probably don't realize how many products we use come from living things. And so different organisms, plants, animals, insects, they provide different services or chemicals or materials that we can find useful. And also biodiversity is good because anytime you have diversity, that equals more stability, and that means better resilience to change. And so by reducing biodiversity, it can really hurt our ecosystems as well as our own way of life. Some of the things that we derive a benefit from living things are we make medicines, we grow crops, we obviously consume food. They're important in nutrient cycles and waste disposal. Things like plants help with flood and erosion prevention. We use biodiversity purely just for tourism and travel and just enjoyment. So we really rely heavily on biodiversity for a lot of things in our lives. And unfortunately, there are a lot of threats to biodiversity. Number one being us. The biggest threat to biodiversity are humans. We do a lot of things that are detrimental. We've already kind of seen this with our cycles. But one of the big things we can do is we destroy habitats. We cut down forests, we dam a river, we completely can change the landscape. And so habitat destruction obviously is going to affect all life that was in that habitat. Something else we can do is we can introduce exotic species into an area. That may not seem like that big of a deal, but when you have these balanced ecosystems with their food chains and food webs and all those kind of things, when you introduce a new species, they don't really quite fit. And so what happens is they don't have that niche, and they don't have natural predators and things like that and natural competitors. And so a lot of times what happens is they grow like crazy. And this is what we call an invasive species, is when they just grow and grow and grow and they reproduce and they start to affect the populations of other organisms. We can overexploit. We overhunt, overfish, overuse. We just don't think about maintaining natural populations. We just use and use and use as much as we need. We can disrupt food chains in various ways. Obviously pollution, like we mentioned earlier, all of these things can be detrimental. Now this one could also be up here. Climate change could also fit under humans because of our carbon dioxide release. We're partially responsible for that, or primarily responsible for that. Disease is one that could stand on its own, but it could also fit up here with humans because humans tend to lead to greater spread of disease among organisms. But sometimes these are natural. And then we do have some natural disturbances, things like geological change or weather change that may be out of our control. But just know that biodiversity is a huge resource and it's very much threatened. We're not going to go into all the different ways that we can make changes and conserve. If you wanted to take environmental biology, that's a lot of what that class does. But just know that little changes can go a long way. There's a lot of things that you can do to help reduce these threats, or even you may not be able to fix the problem, but you can definitely not be part of the problem. So just kind of be mindful of things that you do and how we can maybe conserve biodiversity. And that is going to wrap up our lesson on ecology. A lot of these different topics we're going to revisit with the project. But as I mentioned with the first set of notes, I would still recommend that you be studying your notes, looking over them. Don't just wait till the last minute to study them for the test. So we will come back to many of these concepts. Hope you guys are having a great day, and I hope to see you soon.